So hello everyone, welcome to Houston Methodist Rice Digital Health Institute seminar. So this is our monthly seminar we started last month, and this is a second seminar. My name is Akane Sano. I'm an associate professor at Rice University, working on AI research for digital health. And this seminar I am organizing with Dr. Nigo at Houston Methodist.
Okay.
To,
Hi, nice to meet you, everyone. And my name is Dr. Nigo. I'm the one of the infectious disease faculty here in the Houston Methodist. I also does the machine learning project using EHR datasets, and then I am also moderating this seminar with Akane.
Okay, and today we are very excited to have Dr. Fagundes, Christopher Fagundes from Rice University joining us at this seminar. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Fagundes. So Dr. Chris Fagundes is a professor in Department of Psychological Sciences at Rice University, and he's expert in psychoneuroimmunology. And his research examined how psychosocial adversity, including early life stress, spousal loss, and caregiving burden, becomes biologically embedded and shapes risk for diseases of aging. He directs biobehavioral mechanism explaining disease laboratory that integrate psychological, biological levels of analysis to link psychosocial risk to physical and mental health. And he also directs Rice University's Institute of Health Resilience and Innovation that brings together researchers, practitioners, and community partners across Rice and Texas Medical Center to translate mechanistic science into interventions that reduce disparities and support healthy aging. So he holds adjunct appointment in many different institutes, such as Department of Psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine, Department of Behavioral Sciences at UT, University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Center. Also, he is a chair of Rice University Institutional Review Board. So his work has been broadly featured in many different places, such as New York Times, NPR, Times, and Forbes. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Fagundes. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Akane. I appreciate it. And thank you for the invite. I'm gonna share my screen here if it'll allow it. All right. Are we seeing the correct screen and all that good stuff?
Yes. Yeah, that's
Okay.
good.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me today. I've look forward to meeting some of you, I guess, virtually that I haven't met before, and it's great to see those that I've worked with for a long time. So today I'm going to talk about my field of psychoneuroimmunology, utilizing models of bereavement mostly and dementia caregiving that we've been doing here for the last decade. And then I'm going to kind of transition to talk about how a lot of the work we do on the biological side could really benefit and has started benefiting through work, for example, I've done with Akane Sano, with sort of the digital health landscape. But start off with a little theory here. I want you to think about for a second, when you're distressed, who do you go to? So let's say you were in college, when we're back in college, and you got a bad grade on your test. Who did you turn to? Who did you call to make yourself feel better? Or if you imagine getting laid off for a job in midlife, who's that first person you would call to kind of share that distress with, help you feel better? Maybe you got into a fender bender, same thing. Well, most of the time, what we find is who we go to changes across the lifespan, but there typically is one person at the top of what we call the attachment hierarchy. So in early life, most of the time, it's a maternal figure. From a very young age, about 9 months old, um, onward in childhood, when a child is distressed, when they're separated early on from a maternal figure, and later when something maybe happens at school, typically they want to go to that person to help them, what we call, regulate their emotions, help them feel better. But as we transition from kind of childhood and adulthood, oftentimes we get a reshuffling of our what we would call attachment hierarchy, where we once maybe went to a maternal figure, a romantic partner takes on that role for a lot of things. Sometimes they're better than others at fulfilling that role, but typically at our top of our hierarchy, at certain point in midlife, it turns into our romantic partner. And that persists into older adulthood. Not only does the person that we go to for support, for security, help us emotionally, there's actually a lot of good work that I'll point to in a minute to show that they actually help us regulate our physiology. So, an important part of what I'm going to kind of talk about today to illustrate is what happens when that person at the top of the hierarchy, in this case, a romantic partner, gets Alzheimer's disease or passes away. How do we deal with that dysregulation? And what does that do not only to our psychology, but our physiology? And how can sort of digital health and sort of the AI revolution help with this process? So I just want to go really quickly to work, and this happens in animals that we call that are pair bonding animals, like prairie voles are one of them. And it also happens in humans where there's a bonding from a very young age that literally regulates the system of the child. And there's lots of work that's, beyond the scope of today, but if you've ever taken a developmental psychology class, maybe in college or whatnot, you may remember this idea that if a child doesn't have that sort of one person that they can go to when they're distressed, their physiology seems to be dysregulated and their psychology in a way that doesn't kind of go back to what we call quote unquote normal if that separation is for a long enough time, or if they lose, for example, their mother. It has enormous repercussions across the lifespan for mental health, but also physical health going into aging. Some of the work that I've done in the past has shown these early life experiences can predict things 60, 70, 80 years later, like how strong you're going to have an immune response, for example, to an immunogenic tumor, or how much kind of inflammation is going to be kind of running through the system that's going to contribute to diseases. But in typical normative environments, you have this regulation that occurs. And that regulation then transfers to our romantic partner. And this is work from we've done with our lab to show that you can actually hook people up physiologically um, that are in a bonded relationship. For example, in this case, like a husband and wife, and you can watch them sort of engage in different tasks together. And what you see is their physiology tracking each other. But if you do that same thing to people that are maybe an acquaintance or someone they don't know at all, the physiology doesn't stay the same. We actually regulate our emotions, not just psychologically, but actually physiologically, with that person sort of at the top of our attachment hierarchy. These same studies have shown that in the maternal world of mother and infant, you see these same patterns. Okay, so as I said, though, as we move on to older adulthood, and for one reason or the other, losing a romantic partner to death or to dementia, you can imagine that the physiological system is going to take a toll. And some of my early work was sort of interested in what exactly occurs, not just psychologically, but biologically, when that sort of bond is broken. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is my work on spousal bereavement. So these are grants that I've had in the past. A lot of them funded by NHLBI within the National Institute of Health, to look at how physiology changes after the death of a spouse over that first year. And I'm going to talk about some of the results. Funded, it has repercussions, of course, for mental health, but funded by NHLBI because of what we call the widowhood effect. This is the idea that when one spouse dies, we know in the next year the odds that the other spouse will die, especially or get a heart attack compared to matched comparisons, is much higher. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on dementia caregiving as well. And a lot of my current work in data is on this. Thinking about it in the terms of what we call living bereavement, this idea that, it's sad to even talk about, the idea that you're sort of going through this grief process as the romantic partner that you're also caring for is becoming sort of less and less cognitively available. So the mechanisms that I've been studying for the last decade all start with the stress response system. So just as a primer for that, my hunch is a lot of folks in the crowd have heard one way or the other, based on their schooling or just watching different talks. The brain and our kind of physiology are very much intertwined. So if I'm going to be stressed, for example, maybe it's an acute stressor of some sort. I'm going to have catecholamines flooding the system. This is your norepinephrine, epinephrine. I'm also going to have cortisol being secreted through the system. It's a very adaptive response in the short term. But when we're chronically stressed, it can have sort of major negative repercussions. Going over one of the mechanisms that I study a lot, inflammation, we know that in the short term, when cortisol is released through the system because we're stressed for one reason or the other, it's actually a very adaptive response. And cortisol acts as an anti-inflammatory agent. It's a glucocorticoid. What happens is in chronically stressed situations, bereavement can be one, caregiving could be the other. Theoretically, and we've shown this in our bereavement work that I'll show in a minute, but people have shown it in other work as well. We develop what's called glucocorticoid resistance. And this is the idea that the immune cells, the monocytes, typically what happens is they become resistant to the anti-inflammatory effects of the glucocorticoid agent. And when glucocorticoid resistance is built up, in an unregulated environment, you get systemic inflammation flooding the system. And inflammation, as we know now, is really partly responsible for most of the chronic diseases we have in older adulthood, in addition to playing a significant role in depressive symptomology, and as I'll show you in a minute, grief as well. Another system I want to highlight for a minute, that we know is dysregulated when one is under chronic stress is the autonomic nervous system. And autonomic nervous system has sort of the gas and the brake, as I kind of like to kind of think about it. The gas is your sympathetic nervous system. So that's your catecholamines that I talked about a moment ago being released. Norepinephrine and epinephrine has direct effects on a lot of different facets of the body. If we're talking about inflammation, norepinephrine impacts something called NF-kappa B, which then kind of turns on the faucet for more inflammation. The other side of the autonomic nervous system is your parasympathetic system. And that's the system that I have a lot of interest in, because it appears to be a system that's very much embedded in this idea of whether people can sort of adaptively regulate their emotions. So the vagus nerve innervates the sinoatrial node of the heart, which is your heart pacemaker. And under tonic inhibition, you have parasympathetic activity being high. And when it's high, it's very adaptive for a lot of different reasons. One is that it's an index of your system itself being healthy. Another aspect of it is it's an indicator of you have inhibitory control from the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which allows you to more adaptively deal with stressors when they arise. When we're under chronic stress, what we see is our parasympathetic activity going down, right? Which is, in this case, you would measure it with measuring heart rate variability. Um, when it goes down, you have this parasympathetic nervous system going down. You have a lack of inhibitory control, starting with sort of prefrontal cortex activity and going on physiologically to many different parts of the body. This lack of inhibitory control is a very good index of not just physical health, but how we're regulating our emotions, how we're adaptively regulating our emotions during times of stress. So my work in the first RL1 I had um, was interested in this idea that, do bereaved individuals have lower parasympathetic activity and higher inflammatory activity than matched comparisons, with the idea that that's probably somewhat explaining the widowhood effect. And we found really nice effects for both. If you could see in the left-hand quadrant there, a very significant difference, all things created equal, with people's heart rate variability, a measure of parasympathetic activity, um, in your comparisons versus your bereaved individuals. In addition, we had higher levels of inflammatory activity in the system. And not surprising, our bereaved individuals were more depressed, but you could think of that more as a manipulation check than everything else. Um, I want to point you to, just as kind of point you for a second to our more recent work on caregivers. We're seeing a lot of the same effects here. And I'm just pivoting just for a second. What we're seeing in caregivers is that those that have higher levels of sort of cytokine production, this is sort of inflammation going through the system, they have higher levels of anticipatory grief. And this is the idea of sort of that pain that one feels when one's going through sort of living bereavement. And we also see that the way that they are able to sort of navigate close relationships in general, based on their security or insecurity, seems to somewhat modulate that effect. In addition to our interest in inflammatory levels being different in these bereaved individuals versus matched comparisons, another thing we were really interested in, because physiologically we think it actually probably has even more powerful repercussions, is how inflammatory activity differs under stress for those that are bereaved versus matched comparisons. So, about 4 months after the death of a spouse, at their second visit of the 4 visits we had for this grant over the first year, um, we brought people into the lab and did a standardized stressor. Now, this might seem arduous, but it's arduous in the way that it elicits a stress response, but benign in the sense that it's not sort of connected to grief or loss of a loved one or any kind of other context. The Trier social stress test, this has been utilized in my field for the last 30 years to elicit stress at about every population imaginable. So we bring people in the lab, and first we have to put a catheter in their arm, have a baseline of about 30 minutes before we take the first blood draw. After the first blood draw, they participate in a speech task where they're doing a mock job interview, which elicits a response when people get sort of performance anxiety to a degree. And they also do a mental arithmetic test that is incredibly annoying for any human being and elicits a response. This would be where I asked you count backward from the number of 4,222, count backward 13 as fast as you can for 2 minutes or something like that. And while you counted backward, you had people faking like they were evaluating them, giving them sort of this kind of stone face. Elicits a stress response normatively. But like I said, very benign in the sense of sort of any kind of triggering of the bereaved event. And what we demonstrated is that bereaved individuals, compared to matched comparisons, had higher stress-induced inflammatory activity over the 2 hours after the stressor. So they keep the catheter in their whole time and they get multiple blood draws here. So what's this showing is it's not only people sort of systemic levels or levels of inflammation produced by monocytes when stimulated with, in our case, we stimulate with LPS, but it's also that they're more reactive when they experience a stressor. So you could see that what you're seeing is sort of the stress response system just being kind of one step away from sort of hyperdrive in these individuals compared to matched comparisons. We were also interested in this idea that among the bereaved individuals, can we identify differences in their sort of levels of grief with this paradigm? And what we show is those that were higher levels of grief, so they're hitting or exceeding the clinical cut point on this is a complicated grief scale. What we see is those individuals, sure enough, had a higher inflammatory response than those that were lower on grief. What was interesting about this is we were able to show the uniqueness of the interpersonal experience of grief, meaning in the models, when we even adjusted for depression, these effects remain. So it seems to be something about that, the loss of that figure itself, that really impacts the system in a fundamental way. So showing so far is this idea that you have these interpersonal experiences that are biologically embedded, right? And focused a lot on the stress response and sort of systemic levels of autonomic activity and sort of the inflammatory system. But there's other physiological repercussions of being stressed that are also identifiable through different means. One is sleep. Sleep is very much disrupted when one is under psychological stress, and it might not surprise you that the loss of a spouse very much disrupts sleep. One of my former postdocs that a K award under me actually they did it on a cognitive behavioral CBTI intervention designed for bereaved individuals for this very reason. We see these kind of daily dynamics then impacting people's sort of downstream physiology. Downstream, we know that it's an indicator of higher levels of grief and also diseases of older adulthood, like cardiovascular and cognitive decline, and of course, depression as well. But what we want to happen is we want people, of course, to adjust and to recover. And in the world of bereavement research, both in the animal world and also in human research, which is less, the idea is that for someone to adaptively adjust psychologically and then physiologically after the loss of someone at the top of their attachment hierarchy, they need to update or reorganize their hierarchy. It's gone as far as a lot of people arguing that persistent grief disorder, which is new in the revised version of the DSM, is sort of a failure of what we call a failure of learning. But what they really mean by that is a failure of updating the hierarchy. But the idea is once that is updated, our physiology is going to be regulated as well. But here's sort of the issue that we have here, and I'll show you some graphs in a minute. We do very well at knowing what people's levels of grief are in the moment, physiologically and psychologically, through measurements that, I just articulated. Are they perfect? No. But, we have a good sense. What we have a really hard time doing, though, is being able to predict the future. Who is going to keep adjusting after a loss event and who isn't? And that's one way where I think sort of advances in artificial intelligence, digital health, machine learning can really do a lot of good. I'm kind of thinking about this idea of a digital phenotype. And if you imagine, someone comes into a study visit or a physician's office when they're suffering from persistent grief, right? For our study visits, you're going to assess them at one time point, right? They go to the physician's office, they're probably not going to get a blood draw unless it's for another reason as well. But they're going to get some kind of assessment questionnaire or maybe a structured clinical interview. But that's not daily life, right? That's kind of a snippet. In daily life, we have these patterns of emotions, grief, of course, being one of them that we're talking about now. And there's so many dynamics in that sort of pattern of emotions that can't possibly be captured in sort of a one-time visit state. And one thing we're interested in is if we don't do a very good job predicting future levels of persistent grief from this one study visit or this one doctor's office visit, it might not be because we can't predict it. It might actually be more that we're trying to rely on such little amounts of data. So I want to show you for a second what we see in the grief literature. We see this also patterns in the trauma literature when people are adjusting to a event. We'll use bereavement as one of them here. You have about 5 to 30%, and I know it's a lot of variance, but this is kind of the pattern we see, that is chronically depressed. And their grief is high, but they had sort of a chronic depression going into the grief state, right? Excuse me. We have another group of individuals, and this is probably what one would think of when they think about people adjusting to a loss event. They start off with sort of high levels of grief, and then over time, they go down, right? Sort of this adaptation process. About 15 to 25% people do this. There's actually a large percentage, and this is the good news. It doesn't mean that they're not sad, but they're not suffering from really high levels of grief. 55 to 85%. In the bereavement world, closer to 55. But we have this other group that they start off doing kind of okay, and then sort of they skyrocket over time. The problem is predicting who is going to do what when we're way on the left side of that x-axis is not unbelievably accurate with the data that we have. And one thing I would contend is a lack of momentary data, and also in practice, a lack of physiological data to actually look at sort of these dysregulation changes over time is a lot of the reason why we're just not very good at figuring out who's most at risk. Now, who cares? Well, for two different reasons. One is you can't treat everybody, right? But another thing is, and this is work out of Colombia, to show that if you treat the wrong people after a traumatic event or after the loss of someone close, sometimes you can facilitate rumination and actually it being sort of a maladaptive outcome. So for precision reasons, but also for reasons that have to do with sort of improving everyone's lives, our ability to forecast who is going to be at really high risk versus not has major potential. So you can imagine, two people, equal scores on lots of different variables coming in to a physician's office, or in this case, a laboratory setting. And then you get these diverging trajectories that emerge. And those diverging trajectories, of course, are impacting where people end up, whether in this case, persistent grief disorder versus adjustment. But trying to figure out when these kind of trajectories are hitting these tipping points and emerging, it is not something we're able to do right now. So this is one thing I'm really excited about, with sort of not the only thing, but one thing I'm really excited about applying digital health is these kind of precision targets. To show you two different ways of assessing this that I think will improve our accuracy of prediction a lot more than we can do now, is in daily life. If we could have people's physiology being tracked, you can imagine a day where that would even go directly to a physician's office. Now, of course, you get ambulatory measures of blood pressure when someone has, high blood pressure. Well, imagine if someone's going through a major loss, if you were getting trajectories of people's autonomic physiology and just having that stream. Now, that data would be too much. No physician's going to, of course, without a really high accuracy, be going in like I have in this picture and seeing how the person is doing every day physiologically. But you can imagine a day through quantitative, sophisticated quantitative techniques, better measurements of physiology, where you would be able to create these algorithms where you'd literally be able to know this person is at sort of a different tipping point now than they were before. I show the picture of the physiology, but you can also just imagine inputting people's levels of grief and affect in their phone. Another thing that I'm interested in is newer on the market, is these wearable patches to measure people's systemic levels of inflammation. Um, Talked a lot about sort of cytokines being higher in my slides. Well, one way clinically, I know we have a lot of physicians, of course, on this webinar. One way clinically that people are able to assess inflammation in a reliable way that doesn't sort of bounce around as much as cytokines are, is through measuring C-reactive protein, which is an acute phase protein produced in the liver. Well, it turns out that technology has advanced to the point where there are wearable patches becoming available. Their accuracy is still not tremendous, becoming available that actually can measure changes in C-reactive protein real time. People wear a patch in their environment, and then the signal goes into a wireless readout. You can imagine a day when having these two different physiological systems, combining that with all the data you could get on people's just affect, the signal that you could get and the predictive value you could get in figuring out, who is diverging and who's not would be unbelievably powerful compared to anything that we have available now through static reports. This is just a model that I was kind of thinking of here, where you would move it to once we see stalled adaptation occurs, it would trigger a clinician review. And this is pie in the sky now, but I'm just sort of imagining what this could look like to offer support. And I think we could, there's a lot of things we can build in digital health. And I should mention, and I'll acknowledge in the last slide, some of the work on momentary assessments that I've kind of dreamed about, I've actually been able to do right now with Akane Sano, who is, of course, bioengineer, one of the heads of this. But moving back for a minute, you can imagine where you're, first doing sort of the basic science of validating, observing, validating, and then moving into actually kind of creating interventions. If we know this person's diverging, this would trigger an intervention. It could have real powerful effects. I use the example of powerful effects for mental health. I could be giving really the same talk and talking about cardiovascular outcomes as well. To be honest, if I was writing a grant right now to NIH on this issue, that would probably actually be how I would actually articulate it. So none of this work that we can do now can be done in isolation. It takes engineering, data science, of course, our clinical partners, people with experts. I put my institute in there, the neuroimmunology, and also biostatistics to really bring these together to kind of create these type of pipelines that could turn into real precision science and interventions that hopefully can help a lot of people in a lot of ways that we're not able to now. Want to emphasize, and this is one thing that is beat into every psychology student. If you ever work with a psychologist and you come from a different area, they're going to yap about theory all day, but that's because we're so trained to start with theory. Then we would need common data models and deployment discipline. And of course, we would have to build governance and trust, both for our collaborations, but also for the patients, because they're going to want to know, is my data safe? Is it secure? I think where digital health can help the most, but I might be even short-sighted just to highlight just this one, is if I think about longitudinal designs and anchoring, these validated measures and the infrastructure needed, where I think of digital health first and foremost is the personalized interventions, the timing-based approaches. But that could be short-sighted because I can keep all kinds of things even at the systems level as well that really kind of applies to digital health. I showed that picture of the physician getting sort of this incoming information. You could think of that in terms of almost like a health service pipeline. So to end, close relationships have a powerful impact on people's physical health. Talked a lot about today about widowhood, but there's work in my field in general to show, for example, someone that's in a hostile marriage is at the same risk for premature mortality as someone that smokes 2 packs a day. I mean, it really plays a major role in our system. And health risks may arise when reactivity is not followed by an adaptive recovery and re-engagement. Um, if we're able to identify the dynamics that are in play that can be used to predict outcomes, we would be much more able to intervene at sort of the psychological and the biological level. But of course, it's going to require collaborations with people with expertise doing clinical work, biological engineering, and data science. And that's why I love the team science approach in general, is because you learn new things, and you learn your maybe talking a different language sometimes when you're working with these partners, but you're able to do things that fields just cannot do in isolation. I want to thank everyone for their attention. Thank NIH for funding my work. My wonderful lab, and I have on the right there, partners have been here with me for a long time. I have Akani and Ashu there. You can see on the upper right that you know well in this group. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fagundes. Wonderful talk. It's a completely different field from the infectious disease, but I think it's a very interesting, and it's particularly I'm interested in also predicting the futures, using the EHR data sets. So I just wanted to ask a little bit more about your data input, because I see you using a wearable, but I saw those psychological things are could have more complicated situations like those patients. And then so I just wonder, forecasting for the future changes of those or outcome of those patients, besides those, the EKG or heart rate monitoring, what kind of other variables you are trying to integrate so that way you can be more accurately predict for the future, things.
No, thanks for that. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that the way we're able to assess things mobily is going to change, right? It's constantly changing. So when I started doing work on sort of physiology with heart rate variability when I was a 22-year-old grad student. We didn't have any kind of real mobile device that could sample at the level of hertz needed. You can get heart rate, but at the level of hertz needed to do spectral analysis to get vaguely mediated heart rate variability. Now you can get a crude index even on your Apple Watch, right? So I preface that to say some of the stuff that I would like to do, it's only going to take technology to bring us there. But as of now, in addition to looking at people's autonomic responses in the sense of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, another important index is sort of people's inflammatory. I've never used the patch, but I showed that patch there. Other indexes that could be at play, I don't know any, we can do cortisol with swabs, but any kind of way to look at sort of the neuroendocrine system in real time. I also think that can be mixed and matched, and trying to work with Akani on some of this. Some of this is a challenge of just how to deal with so much data, people's behavior. So you have if you look at people's behaviors in their environment, that could actually add a lot of predictive utility. We know we call it in psychiatry or psychology behavioral activation, but someone's sort of going out and doing things is actually a very good indicator of people doing better. So I think that there's definitely different systems in place, but in addition to that, I think there's data that we can collect or are collecting now, and it's just how to deal with this massive amount of data to create these predictive algorithms when we talk about things like, place, or just inputting our emotions on the phone.
Thank you. Thank you. And then we also receive, a few questions from the audience. So I would like to read out those questions. So you have shown how physiological stress signals cortisol, inflammation, wearable derived markers can reflect downstream biological and then psychological burden after a major life stressor. So my question is, how are you thinking about integrating trait architecture and then behavioral drift into that model so we can distinguish between the patient who experience the same physiological stress signal but have very different risk of disengagement or non-adherence or outcome instability?
Oh, that's interesting. If I understand the question a lot, I think a big part of that is not having a good baseline, right? Because without a good baseline, you don't know where those deviations are coming from within subject. When you have someone that experiences, for example, a loss, they're already in said state. Even if you were tracking people that were maybe caregiving for a loved one before the loss, that's a different state in general. It's not a tremendously great baseline to be able to then map those deviations. I do think that if we had those available, quite frankly, from physicians' visits before any of this happened, right? You could add that in the model as the base and then be able to model what we're talking about, these sort of differences in whether they're trait versus kind of deviation based on the event. So I think that once again is a data issue that could be actually resolved pretty easily in the future if we had information before.
Thank you. Thank you. And then the next question is, are the physiological stress signals seen as effect of grieving process or couple or causative manifestation of the process? So does this mean intervention in the physiology is also intervention for the relief or abrogation of the grieving process?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't think about sort of the psychology and the biology as even like separate things because they're so sort of intertwined. And I think the treatment of one definitely impacts the other. Now, if the question goes, what if you did sort of, for example, a mind-body intervention or something like that? Would that have upstream effects on mental health? So you're like working on the physiology without sort of that cognitive component. Um, my hunch is yes, but my hunch is sort of an integrated approach where you're doing top down and bottom up is going to work on the best. But the short answer, yes. I would say most of the work we do, well, the intervention stuff we do, we definitely, you can imagine, aim one has a mental health outcome, aim two, the physiological outcomes, and maybe some process and mediation, some exploratory aims. So that's how I think about things.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you. I'm just wondering, like, when you measuring those heart rate and then also like EKG, like just the simple things, but I'm wondering, like, if the patient has arrhythmia or other physical conditions affect those things, how you
Yeah.
are filtering out those, you know.
No, it's a really good question. So depending on the study we're doing, sometimes that's an exclusion criteria, right? And we're getting patient records to rule those out because our interest is vaguely mediated changes in someone without a condition. But those things in practice, like if this was moving past, the clean research where you're doing an inclusion exclusion to practice, obviously that would, they wouldn't be excluded. It would be taken into account of. Another thing is if someone is on a pacemaker, right? Well, when they're on a pacemaker, you definitely have a complete, different rhythm.
Mhm.
So they're exclusion for our purposes, of course. But even things like being on beta blockers, you'll see differences. No, those aren't exclusion to us, but we definitely adjust for those things in our models.
Thank you. And then Ash asked, and would you recommend that bereaved individuals receive more frequent healthcare check in the first year or two of their loss?
I'm always hesitant to recommend anything because I consider myself a scientist first, see patients. I would say so. if I was going to say in a big picture abstract way in a scientific paper that that should be something we should look into, yes, absolutely. I think there's no doubt about it. I think the evidence is there. I think, and there's even work right now on doing things like low dose aspirin after a loss. But I'm careful to, dogmatically as a non-physician say that to a large audience without my clinical colleagues, supporting that conjecture. But scientifically, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And then Dr. Taffet asked, what does the recovery process look like? Do the physiological parameters improved before the psychological?
That's a really, really good question,
Interesting.
actually. The timing of these things, right? So it depends on the system to a certain extent. The autonomic nervous system, what we typically see is that getting to restoration before neuroendocrine and then downstream inflammatory. But that's actually a really, really good question. Is what is the time portion of the kinetics? You'll see, and I'm getting a little energy and jazzed up right now because one of the theory papers I was actually working on is I don't think my field takes enough appreciation for the kinetics involved in these restoration processes. So short answer, yeah, autonomic, first downstream. But it's more complex than that. I don't even know if I don't think we've worked it out into humans as well as we should even now. But that's another really I'm very jazzed about as a future direction.
Okay, great. Thank you. Um, Akane, do you have any other questions?
I think, yeah, about this patch, the wearable patch. Are you already integrating any wearable patches into your protocol, or
No, can you
how?
make it?
How I think we have a great collaborator you can work with in our
Yeah.
department, so I'd like to introduce her.
No, I'd love to. I've just read about it. But I've never, yeah, I'd love to. Let's do it. Do you have a
Yes.
collaborator in bioengineering?
Yeah, in our department,
All
yes.
right, cool.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much again, Dr. Fagundes.
Thank you.
Yes, end of this webinar, we will have the questionnaire, and then we are welcome to your all feedback, for the future seminars or this seminar. And then we already have our next seminar, June 29th. That's from the virtual ICU from Houston Methodist. Dr. Gwen will talk about the virtual ICU and then also the experience here in the Houston Methodist. So again, Dr. Fagundes, thank you so much again today. And then we all enjoyed it. Everyone have a good day. Bye-bye.